There is a number in the Union Pacific Railroad's financial records at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School. The number is $27,000. That is what it actually cost per mile to build railroad track across the flat plains of Nebraska in the 1860s. The soil was soft. The terrain was level. The engineering was straightforward. $27,000 per mile is documented in the construction accounts that the Union Pacific's own engineers maintained and that the Baker Library has held since the railroad's corporate records were donated in the mid-20th century. There is a second number. It is in the same records, but it is also in the Congressional record and in the Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864. The number is $16,000 per mile for the flattest terrain, $32,000 per mile for intermediate terrain, and $48,000 per mile for mountainous terrain. Those are the rates at which the federal government reimbursed the Union Pacific for construction. On the Nebraska plains, where actual costs ran $27,000 per mile, the government was paying $44,000 per mile. The difference, $17,000 per mile on hundreds of miles of flat terrain, is the foundation of everything that follows. To understand where that difference went, you need to understand what the Credit Mobilier of America was. It was not a separate company in any meaningful sense. It was a construction subsidiary created by the same men who owned the Union Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific's directors created the Credit Mobilier, awarded the Credit Mobilier the construction contracts for the Union Pacific at prices far above actual costs, and then distributed the profits to themselves as Credit Mobilier shareholders. The mechanism was straightforward. The Union Pacific received government bonds and land grants for building track. It paid the Credit Mobilier to build that track. The Credit Mobilier charged prices substantially above actual construction costs. The difference became profit, distributed to shareholders. The shareholders of the Credit Mobilier were the directors of the Union Pacific. They were paying themselves with public money. The government bonds and land grants that were supposed to finance a national infrastructure project became the funding mechanism for one of the largest private wealth transfers in American history. The total amount transferred through this mechanism, the difference between what the government paid and what the construction actually cost, has been calculated from the financial records at approximately $44 million. Roughly $1 billion in today's dollars through one railroad in one decade. This is documented. The Union Pacific's own construction cost records are at the Baker Library. The government reimbursement rates are in the Pacific Railway Acts. The Credit Mobilier's profit distributions are in the Poland Committee report at the Library of Congress. You can calculate the gap from the documents themselves. The question that the Poland Committee was appointed to answer was not whether the gap existed. By 1872, the gap was known. The question was who in Congress had been paid to ensure that it could exist. To understand why that question needed to be asked, you need to understand Oakes Ames. Oakes Ames was a congressman from Massachusetts. He was also a shovel manufacturer whose firm had supplied equipment to the Union Pacific, and he was a major stockholder in Credit Mobilier. He was, in other words, simultaneously a federal legislator with jurisdiction over railroad policy and a private investor who profited directly from the federal policies he was helping to shape. In 1867 and 1868, as the Union Pacific construction was proceeding and as Congress was considering further railroad legislation, Ames distributed Credit Mobilier shares to members of Congress. He did not sell them at market prices. He offered them at prices significantly below market value, in some cases at par value when the shares were trading at substantial premiums. The difference between what the recipients paid and what the shares were worth was, in practical terms, a payment. Ames was not subtle about what he was doing. He kept records. He recorded the transactions in a memorandum that documented who had received shares, how many, at what price, and in some cases, what considerations were expected in return. The memorandum survived. It is reproduced in the Poland Committee report. It is at the Library of Congress. The names in the memorandum include Schuyler Colfax, Vice President of the United States under Ulysses Grant; James Garfield, Congressman from Ohio, who would become President of the United States in 1881; Henry Wilson, who would succeed Colfax as vice president, James Brooks, one of the Democratic minority leaders in the House, William Boyd Allison, senator from Iowa, James Patterson, senator from New Hampshire, and 9 other sitting members of Congress, the sitting vice president of the United States, a future president, 14 members of Congress in total. Their names are in a document at the Library of Congress that has been there since 1873. The document was the product of a congressional investigation that Congress conducted into itself. It is available to any researcher who requests it. Now I want to tell you about what happened when the memorandum became public, because what happened is documented in the Congressional Globe, the record of congressional proceedings, and what happened illuminates the specific way that power protects itself when documentation threatens it. In September 1872, a New York newspaper called the New York Sun published an article under the headline, "The King of Frauds." The article described the Credit Mobilier arrangement in detail and named the congressional recipients of the stock distributions. It was published 6 weeks before the presidential election. The timing was not coincidental. The article produced immediate denial from every person named in it. Colfax denied having received any shares. Garfield acknowledged a payment, but characterized it as a loan repayment rather than a stock transaction. Other recipients offered various explanations. Congress responded by appointing 2 committees. The Poland Committee would investigate the stock distributions to members of Congress. The Wilson Committee would investigate the Credit Mobilier's business practices. The investigations proceeded through the winter of 1872 and 1873. The Poland Committee took testimony from Ames, from the recipients, and from others with knowledge of the transactions. The testimony is in the Poland Committee report. It is specific, it is detailed, and in several instances it is directly contradictory. The recipients' accounts of what happened do not match Ames's records of what happened, and in most cases, Ames's records are supported by documentary evidence that the recipients' accounts cannot explain. Colfax's denial was disproven by a dividend check. A Credit Mobilier dividend had been paid in Colfax's name. The check existed. He had received it. His denial that he had ever held Credit Mobilier shares could not be reconciled with the existence of a dividend check made out to him. Garfield's characterization of his transaction as a loan repayment was contradicted by the specific documentation in Ames's records, which described it as a stock purchase at below-market prices with dividends credited to Garfield's account. The Poland Committee report documents all of this in 514 pages of testimony, exhibits, and analysis. It was submitted to Congress in February 1873. Congress read it, debated it, and censured Oakes Ames and James Brooks, 2 members out of 14 named recipients. The other 12, including the sitting vice president and the future president, received no formal sanction. Nobody went to prison. The Credit Mobilier's principals kept their money. The Union Pacific's directors kept their fortunes. The $44 million that had transferred from public funds to private pockets through the construction mechanism remained in private pockets. The railroad was built. The Gilded Age began. The Poland Committee report is at the Library of Congress. The Union Pacific financial records are at the Baker Library. The Congressional Globe for the 42nd and 43rd Congress contains the floor debates. The Pacific Railway Acts are in the statutes at large. The documents have been in their archives since the 1870s. Nobody has placed them all on the same table and shown what the gap between the construction costs and the government payments produced, and what the gap between the investigation and the accountability produced. In February 1873, the Poland Committee submitted its report to Congress. Congressman Luke Poland of Vermont, who chaired the committee, had spent 4 months taking testimony, reviewing documents, and constructing a factual account of what had happened. He was a careful man. His report is not rhetorical. It does not accuse anyone of crimes it cannot prove. It presents the evidence, documents the contradictions between the recipient's testimony and the contemporaneous records, and reaches specific conclusions about specific transactions. The conclusions are damning. The report finds that Oakes Ames had distributed Credit Mobilier shares to members of Congress for the purpose of influencing their votes on railroad legislation. It finds that several recipients had given false testimony to the committee. It finds that the Credit Mobilier arrangement had been used to extract public funds for private benefit on a scale the report describes as without parallel in the history of congressional corruption. Without parallel in the history of congressional corruption. Those words are in the Poland Committee report at the Library of Congress. They have been there since 1873. The report recommends expulsion for Oakes Ames and James Brooks. The full House debated the recommendation and reduced it to censure, the mildest formal sanction available. Ames and Brooks were censured. Ames died 3 months later. Brooks died 2 months after Ames. Neither faced criminal prosecution. The 12 other recipients faced nothing. I want to tell you about what happened to James Garfield specifically, because Garfield's trajectory after the Credit Mobilier investigation illustrates the specific mechanism by which the scandal's consequences were managed. Garfield had received Credit Mobilier shares from Ames and had received dividend payments. His explanation that a $329 payment he received represented a loan repayment rather than a dividend was contradicted by Ames's records. The Poland Committee concluded that Garfield's testimony was not credible on this specific point. The Poland Committee's conclusion about Garfield's credibility is in the Poland Committee report. It has been there since 1873. In 1876, 3 years after the report's publication, Garfield was elected to the House of Representatives again. In 1880, he was elected President of the United States. He was inaugurated in March 1881 and was assassinated in September 1881. His connection to the Credit Mobilier investigation was raised during the 1880 campaign. His supporters argued that the Poland Committee had found him not guilty, which was not precisely what the Poland Committee had found. The Poland Committee had found his testimony not credible. It had recommended no sanction, but the absence of a sanction was a political outcome, not an exoneration. The distinction between not sanctioned and not guilty is in the Poland Committee report. The report's actual conclusions about Garfield's testimony are specific. Any reader who consults the report can see what the committee actually found, as distinct from what was said about it in the 1880 campaign. Now, I want to tell you about the land, because the Credit Mobilier investigation was about the money extracted through construction overcharges, but the Pacific Railway Acts created a second mechanism for wealth transfer that the Poland Committee's mandate did not cover. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 granted the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads approximately 170 million acres of public land in a checkerboard pattern along the railroad routes. Every other square mile for 20 miles on either side of the track, alternating with government-retained squares. 170 million acres, larger than the state of Texas. The records of these land grants are in the National Archives under Record Group 49, the records of the General Land Office. The specific acreage, the specific grant boundaries, and the specific transfer documents are in those records. They have been there since the 1860s. The land grant was justified as an incentive to build the railroad. The railroads would sell the land to settlers to generate capital for construction. The argument was that the public land was worth nothing until the railroad made it accessible, and that giving land to the railroad was therefore not a transfer of value, but a creation of value. The actual outcome is in the land records. The railroads did not sell all the land to settlers. They sold some of it. They held the rest as the territories developed, watching the value increase as the population they had attracted grew around the railroad corridors. The land that had been worth nothing before the railroad was worth substantial amounts a decade later, and the railroads, which still owned large portions of it, captured that appreciation. Leland Stanford, one of the 4 principals of the Central Pacific Railroad, was simultaneously the governor of California during the period when the land grant terms were being negotiated. He was the governor of the state that received the grants and one of the private individuals who received them. His personal papers, which are at Stanford University's special collections, document his real estate investments in California during this period. The correlation between the Central Pacific's land grant boundaries and Stanford's personal land purchases is visible in the records. The Poland Committee report covers the Credit Mobilier and the construction overcharges. It does not cover the land grants. The two mechanisms operated in parallel, documented in different sets of records, producing wealth for overlapping sets of beneficiaries. The Credit Mobilier investigation is the one that produced a congressional report. The land grant story is the one you find when you look at Record Group 49 and the railroad principal's personal papers simultaneously. Now I want to tell you what the competitor's video says and what it does not say, because the difference illuminates something important about the difference between journalism and documentation. The competitor's video tells the same story I am telling. Vanderbilt and Stanford and Rockefeller built their fortunes through government subsidy, monopoly power, and political corruption rather than through free market competition. The argument is correct. The mechanisms the video describes are real. What the video does not have is a specific document that shows a specific transaction. It describes the Credit Mobilier without naming it. It describes the railroad land grants without specifying Record Group 49. It describes the congressional corruption without mentioning Oaks Ames's memorandum or the Poland Committee report. The Poland Committee report has 514 pages. On page 47, there's a table that shows the Union Pacific's construction costs alongside the government reimbursement rates side by side on the same page, the gap visible to any reader who looks at it. The document proves the argument with arithmetic that a reader can verify. The competitor's video makes the argument. The Poland Committee report proves it. Oaks Ames wrote down the names. He kept records. His records survived. They are in the Library of Congress. The sitting Vice President of the United States is in those records. A future president is in those records. 14 members of Congress are in those records. The $44 million is in the gap between two numbers that have been in separate archives since the 1860s. Nobody has placed both archives on the same table until now. The first generation of Gilded Age wealth was not created by markets. It was extracted through a documented mechanism, a construction company that billed the government $44,000 per mile for work that cost $27,000 per mile, owned by the same men who owned the railroad, financed by a Congress that had been given shares in the company before voting on the subsidies. The documents that prove this have been in the Library of Congress and the Baker Library and the National Archives since the 1870s. The Poland Committee report, the Union Pacific construction accounts, the Pacific Railway Act land grant records, the Oaks Ames memorandum. The gap between what was paid and what it cost is in those documents. The gap is $44 million. The gap built the Gilded Age. The Poland Committee report is at the Library of Congress. It is the 43rd Congress, 3rd Session, House Report Number 77, dated February 18, 1873. It is available through the Library of Congress's Congressional Documents Collection and through Hein Online. The Oaks Ames memorandum listing congressional recipients and amounts is reproduced as an exhibit in the report. The Union Pacific Railroad financial records, including construction cost accounts for the 1860s, are at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School. The Baker Library's finding aid for the railroad collection is available through Harvard's library catalog. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 are in the statutes at large, available through the Library of Congress and through congress.gov. The land grant provisions, the acreage, the terms, the checkerboard pattern, are in the text of the acts. The land grant records are in the National Archives under Record Group 49, the records of the General Land Office. The specific acreage transferred to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific under the Pacific Railway Acts is documented in those records. The Congressional Globe for the 42nd and 43rd Congress, which records the floor debates on the Credit Mobilier investigation, is at the Library of Congress and partially digitized through the Library of Congress's online congressional record system. The gap between $27,000 per mile and $44,000 per mile is in two archives. The gap is $44 million. The names of the congressmen who were paid to ensure the gap could exist are in a memorandum at the Library of Congress. The documents were always there. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.